Welcome back to Rethinking Politics, episode 70.
Woohoo. Is that enthusiastic enough,
You're
Dan?
so in my head at this point that I paused, knowing that something would come, and, it's just like I could go on, or we could get this out of the way.
Or we can get this started. Well, that tells you how I feel, because right before we started recording, Dan reminded me about not putting my elbows on my desk and saying too many ums and ahs, and so now I'm self-conscious about that. So thought I'd derail your train of thought so we can both be right here with me.
One of these days I'm going to need a standing mic arm so that every time I tap the desk, it doesn't reverberate through the microphone, right?
Yeah, well.
One day
we can have a nice, Joe Rogan style.
Joe Rog. I think that's now a thing.
So we're about 30 seconds in, and I've already decided let's just call it. No, we're good. We'll see you all
Merry
next
Christmas.
week.
Well,
Hope
peace.
you enjoy your break.
That's not true. Don't go anywhere.
This has been us.
Don't go anywhere. We spent a ridiculous amount of time in this. We want to talk a little bit about a phenomenon that is really well manifest in the discussion between Bret Weinstein and Sam Harris. A little introduction to Bret Weinstein. Go listen to it. We've talked to him about him so many times. Bret and Heather. We often refer to Bret Weinstein because often he's the face of it, in that when they visit with somebody else, sometimes it's just him talking to that somebody else.
Yeah, almost always.
Almost always, yeah. When there's a guest, it's.
And to be fair, the YouTube channel is still called Bret Weinstein. It's not called the Dark Horse Podcast, which So
yeah, I think
clearly they're fine with it.
Yes, initially it was clearly intended to be just him. The early episodes were just him. Anyway, his wife now regularly takes part in it and is wonderful. Both of them are evolutionary biologists. Her name is Heather Haying.
Haying. I think it sounds right.
Haying, I think, is correct. And they're remarkable people, and they're a lot of fun to listen to. Also extremely insightful, and as we've noted over and over again, I think they're a critical voice in discussing the science of COVID-19 in the world right now. So you're gonna hear things there that you won't hear anywhere else until, I guess, recently Joe Rogan joined the conversation. Joe Rogan's had a couple people here and there. Joe Rogan covers virtually everything, so no surprise there.
Yeah, but he's gotten a lot of flack for covering alternative COVID treatments and the vaccine hesitant.
Yes.
The fact that he's even enabled that has become a very controversial issue.
Right.
Which is part of what we're talking about today.
Yeah, so party one, Bret Weinstein and company, and Joe Rogan, and through this recent episode especially, that we'll go into more detail on probably. Then, on the other side, you have the institutions and the powers that be, and a particular voice for them in Sam Harris. Sam Harris is notorious in some circles as being one of the four horsemen of the apocalypse, famous for his effective advocacy of atheism and critique of religion. Up there with Charles Dawkins and Hitchens. He's listed with those people. He's a neuroscientist as opposed to like a neurologist. I think that's right, a neuroscientist. Anyway, very intelligent, very persuasive. You watch him in a debate, he's very good, very quick, and he's very, just very good.
And his podcast, it's Making Sense with Sam Harris. It's known for being a very thorough and careful and patient either analysis or discussions, whatever it is Sam Harris is talking about. You expect Sam Harris to be incredibly reasonable,
yes,
to be very well thought out, very well articulated with whatever he's talking about. No one would describe Sam Harris as being hysterical or rash.
No, or merely trusting of authorities, right? He's a man with the intellectual abilities to understand anything he wanted to, and took the time to. And so, it's interesting. His audience is somewhat unique among podcasters. Joe Rogan, I don't even know what Joe Rogan's audience is. I'm sure it includes just about everything, as he covers just about everything. Bret Weinstein, when you compare Sam Harris to others like Bret Weinstein and his audience, there's something more exclusive about it. There is, for instance, a paywall. Now, you can bypass the paywall by claiming, you can click a box that says something like, I can't afford to pay for this, or I want the free version, or whatever it is. And you can get access to all of his stuff. Now, some of his episodes are also just automatically free because they are, they're public service announcements is how he describes them. Yeah. And by adding that barrier, right, as small as it is, even being able to bypass it entirely and do it free.
I would say it's not that small. You have to email.
That's true.
I mean, it's not nothing.
It's not
especially
nothing.
in the world of podcasts where
Yes.
all you have to do is
click
log into Spotify and start listening, or Google Podcasts or Apple Play, whatever it is.
Right. While it's relatively easy to get through it, it is an anomaly, as you're saying, in the world of podcasts. Which makes it a big deal. Which makes it like most of the time that's enough to turn people away, and he's fine with that. This is in part because his audience, as you hear him talk about it and discuss the demographics of it from time to time, is very, very elite. Which again is kind of odd. The podcasts have this kind of reputation for people who want to learn to do things themselves, get their life
being
together.
The everyman kind of medium.
Yeah. And Sam Harris's audience is not that. He has some episodes on learning courage in business, not learning, but trying to be courageous in business, and be principled. And he's obviously addressing the very, very elite, and does so because he knows they're listening in large part, personally knows several billionaires. And, anyway, part of a very elite circle. And he does podcasting because he wants to be insulated from cancellation, right? Like a lot of them. He wants to
independence.
He wants to be able to say things that people disagree with and do it anyway, right? And not have someone over his head, not have some editor, not have some control. So he's not necessarily inherently against. I'd mentioned that he's on the side of the institutions in this particular debate. He's not always on the side of the institutions. But anyway, what's interesting is how he's decided to handle this. And Brad, you were telling me about a particular line that sets this up well.
Yeah, so this whole discussion, the reason we're framing it this way is everyone who's familiar with the COVID debate kind of understands how this works, that you have the main narrative in terms of COVID, which is a large narrative, but relatively straightforward, which is COVID is dangerous, COVID is bad, you need to get the vaccine, and there aren't really any alternative treatments, except now you've got monoclonal antibodies and remdesivir. But otherwise, if you want to end COVID and you want to stop COVID, and if you care about COVID at all, you have to get the vaccine. And anything that opposes that is not just wrong, but is also endangering humanity, is endangering our way of life. And obviously, I'm speaking hyperbolically here, but just to illustrate this main narrative that you've heard before. And a key component of that narrative is the idea that even asking the questions, even having the conversations and questioning things like the vaccine, being vaccine hesitant right now makes you lumped in with anti-vaxxers. You know what I mean? Like, for example, us on our podcast, we've asked a lot of questions, and we've, even encouraged people to listen to Dark Horse podcasts. So anyone listening would probably feel comfortable in saying we're anti-vax, even though we've been pretty clear that depending on your risk, getting the vaccine may very well be a great idea. And so calling us anti-vax is an oversimplification. But anyways, that brings us to Sam Harris. Sam Harris released an episode a while back condemning Bret Weinstein for asking these questions and for basically, as Sam Harris put it, destroying people's trust in this main narrative. And Sam Harris's argument is that Bret Weinstein is going to cause people to die because they're not going to get the vaccine. And so Sam Harris has this episode, Bret Weinstein responds, and then after that, Sam Harris, while having a question and answer episode, discusses one of the things that his audience members kept asking him to do, which is why doesn't he actually have a discussion with Bret Weinstein and talk about it? So Bret Weinstein and Sam Harris have actually talked before, they've had discussions. I think Bret Weinstein mediated for Sam Harris and someone else. Anyways, doesn't matter. The details don't matter. But so they have this history. They know who each other are. You could consider them, at least acquaintances, if not friends.
Yeah.
They probably would have considered themselves,
I would have said friends,
loose friends beforehand. And he's asked the question, why won't he have this discussion with Bret Weinstein? And he basically says the reason is because even having the discussion, even if I'm able to answer all of his concerns, there are still people who are going to hear that discussion and hear him ask those questions. And just by asking those questions, even if I have answers, are going to be convinced to not get the vaccine, and I'm not willing to do that. And he cites a concern for public health and basically this crisis, that in a time of crisis, it's not worth it to risk that. Which is really interesting, which is really an interesting concept, that basically what it comes down to is, during this time of crisis, we cannot, at least in Sam Harris's case, we cannot encourage any kind of dissenting opinion. Just by having a dissenting opinion, you are causing death. He's specifically said that about Bret Weinstein,
Mm-hmm.
that Bret Weinstein, by voicing these concerns out loud, is causing people to die, and Bret Weinstein is responsible for that. And you can understand on a pragmatic level why Sam Harris would be arguing that. If the vaccine is effective and everyone should take it, and people who aren't taking it are more likely to die, therefore it'd probably have to be every few hundred people that Bret Weinstein convinces not to get the vaccine is one more death that is directly attributable to Bret Weinstein. And of course, the obvious response that you get from the opposite side is, if we can't have an honest discussion and ask questions during a crisis, then who decides? Who is the one who decides what is worth saying and what isn't allowed to be said? And this, of course, goes back to the censorship issue that's been had before, but it's not really about censorship here, because it's just about the search for truth and the search for what's right in a time of crisis, which is obviously a very real issue that we're experiencing today. And it's an even more broad issue, because just because it's a crisis now doesn't mean that when it's not a crisis, the answer to these questions won't be important. As long as what we're talking about is important, then having the discussion can theoretically cause people to change their mind and cost lives or cost whatever.
Right.
How do you have any important conversations if your fear is that just by having the conversation means you'll lose people to the conspiracy nuts like Bret Weinstein?
Right. We did an episode shortly after that particular episode of Sam Harris. We talked at length about this battle, this war mindset, right? Where there is an occasion, there are times in life where you can't tolerate dissent. And generally that's because what's at stake and the rapidity of the response have to be, are both extremely high. You have to respond extremely quickly in a coordinated manner with other people. And you have to, or else people die. Right? You can imagine you're in some kind of a military combat scenario, and your commanding officer gives an order while your team's under fire. This isn't like at the planning stage or something. This is in the moment. and he makes a call. To some degree, in situations like that, you can often make the argument that following his call, whatever your personal opinion on it is probably your best chance of survival. Because of just the scenario, right? You need to be coordinated. You need to be working towards the same thing. You don't have time. You have, there are occasions where true authoritarian, just obedience may save your life. And you hope at that point that you have a good commander and you have trust in him and you've built up these things over years, whatever. That seems to be the kind of thinking that Sam Harris was encouraging in that moment. But what's odd about it is it's not that. That's not the situation we're in. We're in a situation where the search for the truth and the study of the truth is precisely what needs to happen. Mm-hmm. Where we're at the planning meeting, at which all voiced dissent can be useful and integrated. Not at the stage of execution, right? COVID is an ongoing search to understand what's effective to address it. And Sam Harris's response to this as an individual, not his particular response to Bret Weinstein's conversation, but his choice in how he should engage is really interesting to me, because go ahead, you had a comment on that, and then I was going to go into...
No, I have so many comments that it's hard for me to organize my thoughts here as we're having this conversation. I just wanted to bring up the fact that Sam Harris has just recently had another public service episode about COVID that was about 3 hours long, talking to a scientist. What was his name? Nicholas Christakis, is that right?
That's right.
Yeah, I wanted to say Christopher Natakis. I got him mixed up there, but Nicholas Christakis. Christakis is an awesome last name. I have no idea what its origin is, but
yeah,
but I like it.
Trippy.
But he has this 3-hour conversation, and it's interesting hearing this conversation because you can see that Sam Harris is a little bit different than he was a few months ago. He's realized, because in these months and years, he's realized more and more again, there's a very legitimate reason that people are upset with this main narrative. He acknowledges the fact that people have been lied to, and now it's an open lie. It's a known fact that they've been lied to by these institutions, who are now the institutions that they have to trust in order to move forward, into this main narrative on COVID. And it's really interesting. I mean, this conversation, it's a long one, but I'm so glad I listened to it. And I would encourage others, especially those of you who are interested in COVID, who are interested in alternative answers to COVID beyond the main narrative, listen to this 3-hour podcast with Sam Harris, because they have really interesting discussions that are the kind of discussions, or at least questions. The discussions are not good, but the questions are really good about what you do to get answers in a time like this. Sam Harris basically raises the question, what do you do when you are not able to actually go and do all of the research, but you're not able to trust the institutions? At what point do you turn to someone else? They have a discussion about how in the history of scientific discovery, there are often times where the established theory is incorrect, and you have a backyard astronomer or a backyard, somebody who is able to discover it on their own that this is the correct answer. And the whole scientific community may oppose it at first, but then realize, yes, that is the correct answer, and make an adjustment. And so they acknowledge that this is actually a legitimate and long-standing practice. But then Sam Harris will then go on to talk about how probabilistically, you're most likely to be correct if you believe what everyone else believes. And it's this really interesting duality that he's trying to balance as he understands. And you can see how over these past few months, his listeners have brought up so many concerns that he's listened to, and he understands these concerns that are being brought up, but it hasn't been enough to change his mind. And you just have to listen to it. It's very interesting. It's just interesting to listen to just for that.
It is, in part because, as you said, he's struggling with the fact that he made that claim that we mentioned initially, that this kind of wartime mentality thing. And he's addressed COVID several times, and he's concluded each time, rightfully, that he has not persuaded anyone. Or, so few that it didn't matter. And he's talked about that openly.
In fact, in this most recent episode, as you listen to the episode, he acknowledges at different points throughout the episode, he says, for those of you who are still listening, who I'm sure haven't believed a word we've said for the last 2 hours, very kind of sarcastically, but not really, that he understands that,
yes,
that what he's doing is not working. And the reason it's not working is because of the fact that from the beginning, he said he's not willing to have an open discussion.
Yes.
And that statement at the beginning has closed so many people off to what he has to say.
Right. That was really well said. And that takes me to where I was going perfectly. Sam could have done a variety of things to begin this COVID-19 and dealing with it as someone with a large audience who people respect, and someone who, is influential and could be influential on this topic. And I think what he did do threw what possible influence he could have had away. And now perhaps he has gained some of it back, perhaps with this most recent episode. But I think he managed to completely sideline himself. And I think how he did that is really interesting. Because obviously that was not his goal. I think part of it is that he didn't appreciate what his audience is expecting of him. Sam Harris could be getting into the studies, educating himself as much as possible, and coming to these discussions as a participant.
Mm-hmm.
He has not. What he does is come to it in the same manner that a journalist does. Here are what the authorities say. Here are what the naysayers say. And to try and navigate that.
Yeah, as an interviewer,
as
a mediator, not as someone who knows anything about the issues.
Yes, and there's nothing wrong with that. If he doesn't have the time or the interest or thinks it wouldn't be worth it for him to get into it.
That's what Barry Weiss does with her podcast.
Right.
Her goal is to interview people who have unique perspectives, but she doesn't bring them on and then say, well, I completely disagree with that. She doesn't push back very hard against these people because her purpose is to give them a platform to have that discussion, not to have an argument, not to be a participant. Her job is a reporter for the most part.
And she does a marvelous job of telling stories.
But Sam Harris's job is not as a reporter. That's not
what people
what
go to
his
him
podcast for. His podcast is there to make sense.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? That's his promise, is that he's going to make sense of what's going on.
So then he sets himself up as a foil to Bret Weinstein, right? A voice in the podcasting world refuting the other podcasters who are on what he sees as a kind of fringe on this issue. But having decided not to search this himself, what he's left with is saying, I hear what Bret Weinstein's saying. I hear what the institutions are saying, the CDC and such are saying. And I have to pick which one I trust based on the little I know. And I pick the CDC and the institutions.
Yeah, and obviously he doesn't word it that way.
No.
But basically what he comes out and says is, I know Bret Weinstein is wrong because all these institutions explicitly state that he's wrong.
Mm-hmm. Which is ironic because he can't know the institutions are right because he decided not to dig in and actually engage the studies fully, and try and be a part of this discussion. So which is why I phrased it the way I did. You're right. That's how he says it. But in essence, what he's saying is, I trust them more than I trust Bret Weinstein, which again is fine. that's to some degree, all of us are in a position where we have to,
make choices
like that. But he wasn't explicit about it. I think he would have had a very different experience with his audience if what he had said was, look, I'm not going to dig into this and try and sort it out for whatever reason. Maybe he thinks that it would not be productive, that he would just be adding noise to the confusion. But then he can't do that. He can't make that choice and also say, and be the proper foil for people who have. Because it ends up, so many of his episodes end up being like, yeah, they're wrong about everything. Well, they've made a variety of specific claims, right? Very specific claims with studies to back them. And those claims are not addressed. There's just kind of a hand waving of, no, don't trust them.
And it's funny when he talks about that, 'cause he says, well, yes, I'll debunk the one specific thing, but then they'll bring up something else and something else and something else, and I'll never get to the bottom of it because they're just whack conspiracy theorists.
Yes.
And there's some validity to that argument, that if someone wants to argue with you, they can always argue.
They can pull up
What's so interesting here is that he's not talking about someone that he knows is crazy. He's talking about someone that he specifically knows pre-COVID to be a reasonable voice. You know what I mean? To talk, and it's so interesting because in this specific instance, which is so unusual, you've got someone who believes, I mean, calling it a conspiracy is a bit much, but who believes alternative theories about the world we live in today, aka conspiracies. I mean, Bret Weinstein and Heather Heying, for the most part, have been pretty careful about what they've argued. They have not claimed this is a big conspiracy.
Yes.
They've just raised a lot of questions. A lot of people who listen to them have then taken that next step and said, yes, this is all just a massive conspiracy. But the point is that for the most part, they've just brought up some very serious concerns. And if Sam Harris had been willing to have that conversation with them, I don't think it would have gone the way that Sam Harris thought it was going to go. I don't know where this fear came from with Sam Harris that all of a sudden Bret Weinstein was going to turn into, I don't even know what to call it, but someone who doesn't care about whether or not something is true. You know what I mean? And it's really interesting.
Right. I can't help but think that he overestimated the threat of COVID significantly. I mean, he talked at one point about how he ordered food and went through this lengthy mini-step decontamination process to take the food that had been dropped off on his porch and get it into his body. And it involved all kinds of disinfectants and cooking the food again. But
it's interesting because it's something that I forget about on a regular basis, Dan. As a blue-collar worker, from basically the beginning of COVID, they said, "Hey, there's this new disease. It's very scary. You need to work from home. You need to quarantine." And I'm like, "Okay, awesome, but I have to go to work." You know what I mean? And I have to be around other human beings on a regular basis. And there's no way I can get around that. Whether or not I pick up my groceries versus going into the store, I'm going to be exposed to people. And that changed how I saw COVID over the next year and a half. Because as time goes on and people continue to quarantine and it continues to even self-quarantine, not talking about lockdown specifically, how that shapes how they viewed COVID versus me, where long before, the vaccine came out, I was just interacting with people all the time because I had to. And you just lived with it. And so it tended to make the whole thing less scary because I had been exposed to it for the past year and a half. But I forget about the fact that for people like Sam Harris, for a lot of white collar workers, and especially for the elite, you know what I mean? The people the people who like Sam Harris are able to do what they do and isolate while doing it. You know, people who work from home, people who were able to make their jobs work from home, people who are able to leave their jobs and live off of the income, you know, that they already have through investments or whatever, have been able to spend the last year and a half isolating. And what that's allowed them to do, and I say allowed them to do, but one of the unfortunate side effects of that is that it means they could have been living in fear for the past 2 years and with no reason not to be afraid.
Right.
Because
nothing that pushes them to confront the world and actually live in it.
Exactly, because COVID could be as deadly as Ebola, and they wouldn't know because they haven't been out and seen the world around them. You know what I mean? When
Right.
all you're consuming is just fear mongering about COVID, you know, through all these many channels that push that, and then you stay at home, and so you're living that choice. It makes perfect sense.
Right. When the polls of how people assess the danger of COVID, are jarring in how far they are from reality and how far the people's assumptions about it, particularly people who've done exactly what you've said, been quarantined basically the entire time and are not interacting with the world and are getting their news from particular sources. Their assessment of how dangerous COVID is way off. Anyway, it's interesting. Whatever Sam's personal psychology regarding COVID is and why it is that he deals with it in this manner, I think at this point you can objectively say what his attempts, as he has assessed them, have failed. And part of this is because I think there's a changing landscape of information. We do not live in the world where all information is filtered prior to us receiving it.
Or at least not filtered by the same sources.
Not filtered by the same sources, yes. Thank you, that's better.
It's almost always filtered by someone.
Yes. Even then the selection for it to be somewhere is a filtering process. You're right.
Exactly.
That's more precise. Which means it used to be that people outside of the normal narrative really were isolated and fringe and more frequently, I think, eccentric and crazy. This would be an interesting thing to look into and study because where they're getting their details from matters, and they just don't have access to that much information that other people don't also know. They're drawing from the same articles in newspapers and the same shows and the same, you go to the library and you find an obscure book and then they read it and they get these conspiracy theories, and you show that book to someone who's well educated and informed, and they look at it, and within 2 seconds, they can take it apart because it's actually nonsense. This book is clearly poorly written and all these other problems with it, right? That is not the case anymore. The people on the fringe of the people outside of the mainstream narrative of COVID-19 are not crazy.
And they're not fringe either. They're a large percentage of the U.S. population.
That's right. That's a really important qualifier. They are not fringe, and they are not few in number. And what's interesting is if you want to hear people discuss COVID-19 data, you go to those people because they're the ones discussing it. We've dug around the CDC's numbers for probably like a year now. Not every day, right? But off and on for a long period of time. And I feel like today I finally located the place in which they make most of their significant arguments, and they have their references to studies. Right? In some ways, this is the most useful place to be looking at their information. And it's buried in there. We finally found the actual doctor guidelines, right? Where they're making the case to doctors. But even that isn't as explicit as I would like. I would like to know why they included, they'll talk about a specific drug and they'll list studies related to it and they'll state their conclusions and things. And I would like to know why they picked those studies and not others, right? Why they are overlooking the errors often acknowledged in these studies. but not overlooking the errors in other studies, right? How do you get to this? This is the discussion I want to hear. This is the discussion that has to happen at some level to navigate the studies to determine what's relevant and what is picking up something else. And if you think the studies speak for themselves, they don't. They usually don't, especially in medical treatment. There are so many variables. Even if you're beyond the... One of the things we've learned from this is it's just so hard to get a good study. Not like a good study in the sense that it's double blind and all of the things that make it kind of the gold standard for evidence, but just a study that is done well, that isn't clearly biased in some sense, isn't clearly trending in a particular direction. It's surprisingly difficult. And I think we underestimate how easy it is for, science does not speak for itself, despite Fauci's proclamations. But beyond that, when you're looking at the effect of drugs, some drugs are only effective in combination with others. Some drugs are effective early, not so effective later, and ineffective in the late stages. Some drugs are only effective above certain dosages.
It's not a black and white equation of does ivermectin work or does hydroxychloroquine work. It's does it work at this dose and or with this combination of other drugs.
Right. So a single study, even perfectly done, will not rule out a drug. Unless, I guess it could if it were like, everyone who takes this dies. Fair enough. But most cases, right, this is a single study because they're going to study it at a single dosage at a single time so that it's consistent, right? They've got you limit the variables, but by changing those variables, you often change the effectiveness of the medical treatment. So it's interesting. People will do things like they will cite a study and they will say, this study shows that, ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, what else is the controversial? Those are the two controversial ones I hear a lot.
The most controversial ones, yeah.
And they will say that this shows what we need to know, and it can't. It really doesn't in most cases, and where these are so harmless, at least, where they're so taking them has so little impact on the health of the person.
Yeah, especially ivermectin. I know hydroxychloroquine does have a little bit more risk, and I haven't looked into that one fully. But ivermectin at least, like even looking at the NIH's treatment guidelines, they're very clear about the fact that it has very low risk.
Yeah, it's one of the least. I've heard, and it seems from what we've found this is accurate, that it is one of the least harmful drugs in terms of side effects. It seems to have virtually none for almost everybody. Unlike the ones you hear advertised on TV all the time that may kill you or cause you to kill someone else. I don't know. What are the most ridiculous side effects? Grow wings, something.
Yeah, but the thing is these drugs and how they're used is complicated. I mean, a great example of this is now, even with the vaccines, we've realized that it's not black and white either, that the data is much more complicated than we were initially told. It's not, these vaccines are 95% effective at stopping you from getting COVID. No, these vaccines are actually 95% effective at stopping you from getting hospitalized and dying with COVID. And actually, those numbers change with Delta, and those numbers change with Omicron, and those numbers change based off of when you received your last dose. And it changes based off of whether you got Pfizer, Moderna, or J&J. And it changes if you get a booster, and all of these factors make it so that the vaccines are a lot like these other drugs in that it's complicated. I mean, it's not super complicated, but there is varying degrees of effectiveness based off of how you're using it. And these drugs are like that, but in an even more complicated way. That how much the dose is, how much you administer it, when you administer it, how early on in the process has an effect. I mean, monoclonal antibodies, which are now approved for use, do work that way. You know, the official guideline is you test positive and you're in a high-risk group, depending on where you live, you should get monoclonal antibodies right away and they'll help you. And if you don't get monoclonal antibodies and you get more sick after getting testing positive for COVID and we want to admit you to the hospital, at that point, we will no longer give you monoclonal antibodies because they're reduced effectiveness, even though they still have some effectiveness and it's unclear how much they do. They just stop giving it because that's the official treatment guideline and there's no flexibility in it. What's really interesting, Dan, with this world that we live in now is that the real world in terms of COVID is very muddy and very complicated and not straightforward. Even talking about it like we are now is simplifying it just to talk about it because it's the real world. We're talking about billions and billions of people.
Right.
We're talking about very different strains of the virus. You know, we label them Omicron, Delta, and the main strain, but it's even more nuanced than that. You know, even the viral, you know, the amount of the virus you get infected with varies person to person, and how your body handles it is a unique experience. And all of these things have really significant impacts on how we should be looking at this virus. And we can't do all of that as we're talking about it. You can't even do all that as you're trying to diagnose the problem and then find ways to treat it. But we can try, and we can, and the best way that we believe to do that is to have the most open conversation possible about what's going on so that we can be open to these ideas. We can be open to having different ideas. And but that's not what's being done. What's being done is you have a main narrative that is very black and white and very straightforward. You know what I mean? The vaccine works, period. No question mark, no caveats. You know what I mean? And the vaccine is safe. No questions, no caveats. These alternative treatments like ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine and fluvoxamine don't work and are not safe.
Yes.
Period.
Hydroxychloroquine has been forbidden by the official guidelines, and there are people that have been fired for using it.
For using it. Even though it's much muddier than that, to the point that if you look at the NIH guidelines for COVID-19, they actually acknowledge that ivermectin does not have enough evidence to be either promoted or banned. Here's the recommendation, the official recommendation from the NIH. There is insufficient evidence for the COVID-19 treatment guidelines panel, aka the panel who wrote this, to recommend either for or against the use of ivermectin for the treatment of COVID-19. Results from adequately powered, well-designed, and well-conducted clinical trials are needed to provide more specific, evidence-based guidance on the role of ivermectin in the treatment of COVID-19. If you said that on a podcast, without quoting it, if you just said that as your own idea, you would most likely be labeled anti-vax or fringe. But that's what the NIH says. The NIH says that we don't think you should recommend against using ivermectin. AKA, if a doctor wants to use ivermectin, there's no reason we can think of to tell them not to use it.
We lack the evidence to say don't use it.
Yeah, that we have nothing to say to them. That we think there should be more studies done, and until then, you know, it's up to you.
Yeah, it's interesting. But
the point is, and how that's been used by the main narrative is nothing like that.
No.
It's do not use ivermectin.
Yes.
Don't do it.
It's interesting because there is a serious discussion to be had about drug evidence. When you try to approve a new drug, it's tested thoroughly. You get the FDA, it goes through this extensive process that may or may not be ridiculous and to a degree corrupt. But we can all agree that there should be as extensive testing so we can learn as precisely as possible the benefits that as we can, right? If I'm going to put something in my body that may give me anything from headaches to heart failure, as is often the case when you're putting drugs in your body, you look at it, varies a lot. You want to know exactly what are the odds that I die for taking this, because it's entirely possible that that's not worth what it's going to do for me. Assuming it works for me, which it may not, because everybody's different and it's not always 100% consistent, even in its efficacy. And so if you're going to make this kind of decision, you're weighing potential benefit against potential risk, right? And to discover precisely what those values are, you need the most effective studies, and many of them, so that you can show that it's replicable, so that you can show that it's consistent as you vary dosage and the other variables we talked about. Right? So you can see all of the complexity and all of the variables and put them in their proper place and say, for this group of people with these conditions, this may increase their quality of life. Right? That takes years and years and a fortune in money to do. We still have not had enough time to do that with COVID. And with the variants, we don't have a prayer of doing that. If we wait for that level of evidence, that level of precision, we will never get it. Which brings us to a serious problem. And then if you add this fact that if you could go for a lesser bar of evidence, right? You could say, well, what signals that it's good against COVID, and weigh that against the known risks, right? We're looking at drugs that we're familiar with, ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, others that we already have. A new drug obviously needs to go through some kind of other process. And we say, what are the risks? What are the potential benefits? Ivermectin signals well that there's a significant benefit, right? Maybe in some cases a huge benefit, depending on how it's administered and things. What are the risks? Negligible. Least risky, one of the least risky drugs we've ever seen. Why is that not enough? Now, I get why it's not enough in other circumstances. I get why that's not enough when a new drug is coming out. And I get why it's not enough when the risks are high.
Well, and I think we should clarify at this point what we're talking about, because what we're talking about is not a new drug coming into existence that we're going to use to combat COVID that has a strong signal. What we're talking about is doctors using a drug off-label. And that is actually a standard practice in medicine where you have something new that you don't know what to do with. And so you start experimenting. And one of the easiest ways to experiment is with drugs that already are approved for other uses that have an established safety track record. And that's what ivermectin is. That's why people used ivermectin back in early 2020 when there was barely even a signal, when there were some early lab work that showed something that had an interesting reaction. And doctors said, okay, well, we have people dying of COVID right now. We know ivermectin, it's got a 40-year track record, so we'll start using it because worst case scenario, it does nothing, and that cost us nothing.
Right.
And that's why we have a stronger signal now, is because those early doctors used it, and we're like, wow, I've seen some interesting results where it does seem to be helping my patients. Let's do some more studies. And studies were done and said, okay, there is something here.
Yes.
And then other studies were done that said, I'm not seeing something. And now you have this big question mark about how effective it really is, but no question mark about how dangerous it is.
Yes. The potential risk is almost, it's virtually zero. For anything serious, it's zero. It's interesting. Some of you may have heard about the articles about people overdosing on ivermectin and being in the hospital and blocking gunshot wounds. That was entirely BS. It was entirely BS. I heard someone who's very familiar with numbers say that they had never heard of anyone ever being hospitalized for ivermectin. You could actually take a ridiculous amount and be fine. It's interesting. We have a weird, again, I think this is probably due to inflexibility because it's a political system. A political system cannot adapt. It has one method for approving drugs. We then got emergency authorization for the vaccines. And I assume that applies somewhat to the drugs, but again, it creates a certain system.
And that was one of the problems, Dan, is that we actually got EUAs for the drugs. Because so you have 2019, right? It's 2019.
Right.
And any doctor can use ivermectin to treat anything if they think it might work. You know what I mean? That they're like, hey, I have this new disease. I don't even know what it is. They're like, well, we'll throw ivermectin at it.
Yeah, see if there's
no one's going to fire that doctor, right? Then you cut to 2020, and they're like, hey, ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine are showing some interesting results. And I can't remember which one got an EUA or if it was both of them, but at least one of them got an EUA temporarily. The federal government said, use this. And then they said, don't use this. And all of a sudden it went from neutral to yes to no instead of remaining neutral the whole time, which is something that I would have preferred. And this is where I want to take a brief moment to pause here and say, as we're talking about this, you're obviously thinking, okay, well, what they think is we should replace the vaccine with ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine, to which your response is, well, the vaccine also has a near zero death rate, so why wouldn't we just get the vaccine if it's already proven to be more effective than ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine? And I would respond with, well, that is an excellent point, which is why we are not anti-vax, which is why we stated quite recently, hey, look at your risk stratification, look at your comorbidities as well as your age, and you make a determination for you. That is what we recommend. You know what I mean?
Yes.
And the other thing the third factor I forgot to mention is whether or not you've already had COVID, because the data for naturally induced or infection-induced immunity is very strong.
It's not because, one additional thought on that, there are categories of people for whom the vaccine may be more dangerous than COVID-19. And it's not because the vaccines are super dangerous, right?
That's just because COVID's not.
It's because COVID for a large group of people is such a negligible threat that there's no reason to even, for them to even contemplate it other than if they interact regularly with someone who is elderly and to protect others.
Yeah. And there's no reason for young people, there's no reason for kids to be given ivermectin prophylactically.
For the same reason, there's no reason for them to get the vaccine.
Exactly. Because even with ivermectin's mild symptoms, it doesn't make sense. And then, so that's the first part, is that not anti-vaccine. The second part is we're not saying replace the vaccine with these drugs.
Right.
We're saying we want these drugs to be available for doctors to use where they see fit. And there's been a very strong push over the last year and a half to make that very, very difficult for doctors to do.
Right.
I mean, I've heard of there's lots of anecdotal evidence for how much doctors have struggled. There's news articles about it, about hospitals blocking it, pharmacies making it very difficult for them to prescribe drugs that they see as helpful for their patients without any safety risks, or at least negligible ones. And that's what we're looking for. We're not looking for the government to mandate that everyone gets ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine, or even that they encourage it. Just allow it.
Mm-hmm.
And we're not asking that the vaccines be taken off the shelves. Not at all. Keep the vaccines.
Mm-hmm.
The vaccines serve a very real purpose.
Right. They
just don't mandate them.
Right. They may be.
If you want to know that what our overall opinion is on all of this, it would be that,
It would be. I'm glad you mentioned that in case you haven't been closely following and tracking our opinions over the course of this.
If you're just listening to this episode, this is where we're at. It hasn't changed.
It hasn't changed. In part because, and I think that neutrality, that lack of a mandate for or against things is necessary because of the variations in risk depending on your circumstances. that you are injuring somebody by mandating one of these or forbidding one of these.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting. We use the word signal because that's what I've heard other people use when they talk about.
It makes us sound smart.
It does. And then I was just thinking about how how it really obscures the point to some degree. People looked at, you mentioned ivermectin as people throwing ivermectin at things because it's so harmless that there's almost no reason not to, because it may help, especially if it's related to some of the things we know about ivermectin. But then there's the places that were taking ivermectin for other reasons that then didn't get significant COVID waves. And so people were looking at that as another signal. What do we mean by signal? We mean evidence. Mm-hmm. It's strange that there's been such a praise and focus on perfect evidence, conclusive, mm-hmm. Complete, precise, that to some degree, the scientific community seems alarmingly blind to other evidence. If you look at a place that takes ivermectin prophylactically, and you combine that with a signal like, oh, these doctors are messing with it here, they're trying it, seems to be working. Oh, places that take ivermectin all the time for the deworming effect, to avoid certain things in their area, in their native areas, and it's very cheap, so you can give it to them instead of other things anyway. And they're not having it. These two things combined together give you a correlation that is evidence. Is it proof? Does it give you the specific degree to which ivermectin is effective? No. Is this all you need? No. Is it so little that you shouldn't consider it? No. It's, right? There's degrees of evidence that we seem unable to even identify.
No, and when they talk about signals, typically what we're talking about when we say signals is you have a doctor who's got his several hundred individual patients.
Yes.
And he starts using ivermectin and notices positive results in a few patients. That's a signal because it's evidence, but it's a very small amount of evidence.
Right.
Or as you said, hey, we notice this group of people who are doing better who also have ivermectin, but we haven't controlled for all the other variables.
Yeah.
Which is why it's still a signal. But as soon as you start getting into the realm of, well, we have studies that show a positive result for ivermectin, that's not really a signal anymore. If you have one study, just one study that's well conducted, that has evidence that ivermectin is effective, that's not just a signal anymore. That's strong evidence that there's something there.
Yes. You're right. Signal is useful to distinguish between that which says, look closer, and
there's
that which says...
There's something interesting here, versus saying there is something here.
Yeah, because the doctor who uses ivermectin, even if he has thousands of patients and seems to see improvement, we don't know enough... I don't want to get into all the nuances of why studies are better than other evidence, but we... Honestly, that may mean nothing, right? It may be sheer coincidence. There's no way to tell based on that alone. Hence the need for studies, why they're so important. They carefully try to control for variables so that you can isolate the thing that makes the difference. And they do that through a variety of means if they're done well. That's awesome and extremely useful. Like you said, that at that point constitutes a kind of proof, but all of it can be thought of as kinds of evidence, right? You can have evidence of something that didn't happen or that isn't true. But what we want doctors acting on the available evidence. And we're not allowing them to do that. We're allowing them to act only when we've achieved a kind of perfect evidence, right? The conclusive proof. This is not how you should act in a crisis where you may not ever get to that perfect level of proof before things change or before, people will be dead at that point. And so you have to weigh the level of evidence, the potential benefit with the potential risk. You have to go by a different standard that is to a large degree forbidden because of the top-down approach of dealing with COVID-19. And it's unique to COVID-19. We didn't do this. We don't do this with other major issues and with other illnesses and with other things. It's a mistake. And if you want to know why we might be doing it here, this is from one of the studies we were looking at. We were looking at the hydroxychloroquine is an interesting one. The more I looked at it, the less sure I became of anything I had thought about it. I found a systematic study that showed 42 different studies on hydroxychloroquine. They have different points, at which they're administering it, different amounts and so on, and what they're administering it with and things. Of the 11 that took place before hospitalization, outpatient studies, this is treatment of people who generally have less serious cases. All 11 of them showed significant positive results. Right? But then I look at other studies and I find varying things. They account for only 3 of them showed negative effects, that it was actually harmful, right? Anyway, I'm not going to get into the details of that. I think it's probably a mistake to have categorically said don't give people hydroxychloroquine, because there are so many studies that signal it does some good, but there are also studies that signal that it is actually neutral. That aside, this is back in May 2020. We didn't have a lot of the information that we had. We didn't have as many of the studies. We didn't have as much. This is a quote. Although preclinical results are promising, to date there is a dearth of evidence to support the efficacy of chloroquine or hydroxychloroquine in preventing COVID-19. Here's the key line. Considering potential safety issues and the likelihood of imparting a false sense of security, prophylaxis with chloroquine or hydroxychloroquine against COVID-19 needs to be thoroughly evaluated in observational studies or high-quality randomized controlled studies. Again, the signal is good. Things look promising. We need better studies. I think we can all agree that that's what we all want that. Question is, what do we do with the evidence in the meantime, with the good evidence that it worked? That is, I think, more in debate now. Well, if you're worried about imparting a false sense of security, are you making the best medical decision for the cases in front of you?
Mm-hmm. Well, and that line really encapsulates what Sam Harris is talking about, and what isn't being talked about but is understood by so many who insist that there cannot be a discussion. And it's that right now, fear of COVID is what drives people to get vaccinated, right?
Right.
And, well, I mean, I guess not as much now. I mean, you've got the OSHA mandates back on, so now we might have a fear of losing our jobs. But up until now, we've been using fear of COVID as our main instrument for getting people protected against COVID. And if people aren't afraid of COVID because they believe there are other treatments that don't actually work, less people are going to get the vaccine. And that's true. You know what I mean? That makes sense. I see why Sam Harris believes that, because that's very logical. But it's such a disturbing line of reasoning where you argue that you have to ban these drugs and you have to ban dissent, both literally and in both technically, where you have groups like YouTube and other things banning these discussions, and also in a more vague sense where people who want to have these discussions can't find a platform willing to host them, where there's enormous social pressure, which is not the same as a federal mandate, but social pressure is a very real and powerful tool that I think has been very effective at neutralizing this debate. And the reason is because we have to keep that fear alive and well. And that's kind of disturbing when you think about it, when your main instrument of choice is fear.
We have this study, at least, admitting that one of the things that is deterring them from recommending the use of hydroxychloroquine,
or not even recommending it, but
giving a positive review, despite the results being promising, despite the first line, although preclinical results are promising, to date there's a dearth of evidence. Right? The evidence that we have, there are things we don't know, but what we have and what we're looking at now looks good. We don't want you to interpret it that way. We want you instead to avoid that. We want you instead to conclude something different than what the information suggests. Why? Because we think that will influence your decision so that you make the best decision in the long run, which is what? In this case, probably to support the vaccine or to look for something else, right?
No, and that's the whole point. I mean, you read the CDC guidelines and their instructions, and sometimes when I'm reading them, I feel like I'm reading something written for a child. If you go and you read the myths and facts about COVID-19 vaccines, specifically for children, because this is one where the nuance is super important. This is not black and white. Arguing that it's black and white is so misleading.
It is.
And they go and they have these myths and these facts, and they're just they're so simple, and there's very little easily accessible information behind them. Reading this NIH document that's 200 pages long has been so nice for me, because in this 200-page NIH document, they actually have the studies right below each of their conclusions. When they say something about hydroxychloroquine, they say, this is why we believe that. And I look at it and I read it, and as Dan said, I'm like, okay, there are some convincing arguments being made here. These studies about hydroxychloroquine seem well done, and they seem to have some evidence that points to the fact that at least how hydroxychloroquine was used in these studies was not effective. Yes, it's possible that mixed with other drugs or maybe administered in a different way, you could have different results, but this at least is raising a real question for me about whether or not simply giving people hydroxychloroquine is even a good idea. Right? And I was able to come to that because they had some reasonably laid out data that I could look at. But this document is not easily available. It's not easily found. It's not meant for any normal person to read. What normal people are supposed to read is these cute little bullet points from the CDC that say, do what you're told. Or listen to the Sam Harris podcast that's designed for intellectuals and for people who know how to think and how to reason. And even that 3-hour episode is not that different from the CDC. And what's crazy about this is that, as Sam Harris has acknowledged, is it's actually having the opposite effect that people expected it to have. I think there are a lot of people who are anti-vaccine right now who, if exposed to the evidence that I've looked at, would get the vaccine. I firmly believe that. If they had been exposed to it, instead of being told and being cajoled and being forced, if they had just had that open discussion on public display that people could listen to, I think a lot of these people would be like, yeah, that actually makes sense for me to get the vaccine. A lot of my concerns have been addressed. But because of the way that they've been treated and the way they've been told, the way legitimate concerns have been dismissed and the way open discussions have been banned, have created a situation where it is very, very difficult to be in the middle. There is no room for the middle. There is no room for having a couple of concerns. There is no room. I mean, Joe Rogan is a great example of this. Joe Rogan was not like Bret Weinstein, who was digging through the evidence and said, here are some real concerns. He's just a guy who has a podcast who brought people on, asked them some questions. They told him interesting things. And he's like, that's very interesting. If that's true, that could change my mind. Oh, I look into it. That does seem to be true. You are changing my mind. And next thing you know, he's this anti-vax symbol, which he really isn't.
No, he's a surprisingly reasonable human being. It's interesting. There used to be a much clearer information hierarchy. And that hierarchy could decide, the people at the top could decide, we can give them the information that we know is accurate and try and make the case and hope that they react like reasonable human beings and, and in general that this has a good outcome. Or we could control the narrative and we could tell them the things that we think will get them to act in the way we are. Now, I think that people believe we're still in the world where that's possible. And I don't think we're in a world where that's possible anymore.
Where what's possible? You want to phrase it a different way? Yeah.
So I think there used to be those two options because you were the only one seeing the initial information. You were the only one. There was such a barrier between. I mean, even to this day.
Gotcha. That as the authority, the expert, you could get the raw information, decide what's right for the people, tell them, and they'll believe you. But now they have access to that raw data too, and so you can't make that decision for them.
Yes, precisely. Access to the information has changed in so many ways. There's so much at our fingertips that you can no longer. That's no longer a wise solution, at least in a place like the United States where Google is, I was going to say, fairly open. It is relatively open, right? We're not China where various kinds of information are censored. Like you can't find it, right? You can't get to so much information. Brad and I can go and we can look at these studies. We can say, you think that this, because of this study, you think this. Okay, well, let's take a look at that study and let's take a look at similar studies, right? We can do that from our couch with a few clicks, right? That's extraordinary. We don't have to go to a big university library and check out obscure medical journals to see the data. That changes everything. It really does. If you think that you can there's so many news organizations that still think the current best plan is for them to tell people the things that will get them to do the right thing rather than tell them the truth.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's
noble lies.
Right. I think it's a horrible mistake and those institutions are becoming less and less trusted. And
with good reason.
With good reason. People will no longer tolerate that kind of, very few people have that kind of faith in institutions at this point. Too much has become political. Too much is obviously driven by other things, right? There's so many things have become atomized in our society. And maybe it's for better as long as the institutions are corrupt. Maybe if they were better, then you could make a case that people shouldn't be listening to fringe sources. If you've already got the truth, then I don't know. But anyway, it's an interesting question. The debate needs to be had. I think what you said was absolutely right. I know a lot of people who are against getting vaccinated, who I think would get the vaccination if they had the facts in front of them. They do not have the facts in front of them because the people arguing on behalf of the vaccination will not give them to them because they don't use the facts because they think it will undermine them. They think being like, you know what? The vaccines have not been nearly as effective as we had hoped. They're barely doing anything to slow the spread of Delta. It's a negligible difference in how they're spreading. They may do nothing with Omicron, right?
Well, and
but
part of
you
it
should still take it because of this. This has proved to be effective, even though these other things, right? That kind of case is not being positively made.
Well, and part of it is the way that they're portraying the information. A great example of this is so many media agencies, when the vaccine first came out, reported on the vaccine as if it was a sterilizing vaccine.
Yes.
As if getting the vaccine meant you would not get COVID. That is how they reported on it.
Yes.
And then at some point in the past year, they made a switch saying, obviously, COVID doesn't do that, but here's what it does do. And there was no, hey, we made an error in the past. They talk as if that's how they've always discussed it, which is very disingenuous and makes you not want to trust what they have to say about it. That's just one example of the way that not being upfront and clear with the facts and the evidence puts you in a bad position, because they were afraid early on to say, hey, this is what's effective and this is what we know. And every time they do that, they push people further away. And what's interesting about that is you can't push people into the middle. You tend to push them to the opposite side. A great example of that, is Peter McCullough, who I enjoyed listening to his 3-hour episode with Joe Rogan. It was very helpful. It was a great episode, but it doesn't mean that I believe everything Peter McCullough says. You know what I mean? It doesn't mean that he's right about everything. There are lots of things that he's wrong about. There are lots of things that he doesn't get right, or things that I'm not sure about.
Yes, that at the very least you're going to remain skeptical of until you've looked into.
And the problem is that it's so difficult for me to maintain any kind of, I don't even like the term moderate, but trying to maintain my own independent opinion that's not the CDC's and not Peter McCullough's is very difficult. And so what most people do is they just pick one and leave it at that.
Right.
And the problem is that reality is always much more complicated than that. And the environment we've created is such a one that there is no room for 1,000 different opinions that are all a little bit different. There's only room for the one correct opinion and the one wrong opinion.
Yet looming in the back of your opinions of COVID is what you think of Donald Trump, clearly. So,
oh, of course, yes.
So if that's, that's how people talk about it, right? As if that were a key factor in what you should think about it. It's we need more. I would love for people from the CDC to get together with Bret Weinstein or, what's weird is we've found good conversations at this point. We do not find good conversations between people on opposing sides.
Yeah, people who disagree. And that's why we started with Sam Harris, because Sam Harris was the one person we hoped who's, hey, he's got the main narrative beliefs, but he has the wisdom and intelligence to realize that what you need here is that kind of discussion.
Yes.
And he didn't. And that was super rough for me personally.
This is your introduction to him in some ways.
No, because you had shown me him before. I listened to a few episodes of his that I really enjoyed, but for me it was so demoralizing when he wasn't willing to go there, because I'm like, if he's not willing to have this kind of discussion with someone he already knows and respects, then who's going to have this discussion? Who's going to have this open forum and a place where you can actually talk about these things? And I just don't see it happening. I don't think it will.
Right. Having found, as we mentioned this, that the actual guidelines from the CDC where they're intended for medical experts in things, where they actually list the studies and the arguments. What would be awesome would be for somebody to take some of the most controversial things, ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, and others, from this, explore the case that is made and have a back and forth, right? People who agree and people who disagree, and say, here's why, having looked at this, I think that the CDC is wrong here, right? That their conclusion is false. Here's why. Here's my counter evidence, right? Wouldn't that be like, this used to be what happened. Like this is how medical research is done. You get competing groups who've come to their own conclusions, who then get together and talk about it. And it's odd. It's sad that hasn't happened with COVID-19. The best we can get is we look at what other governments do, right? We do a kind of international search, because in some ways the United States has become so monolithic, and it's
it's single approach to each aspect of the approach is singular.
Yes.
Whether it's ivermectin or the vaccines, it's the same for everyone across the entire country.
Yes, and there hasn't,
for the most part.
Yes, it's become standardized and in how treatment happens and things.
No, and that's one of the reasons we have so many studies and so much data about these alternative treatments, is only because of other countries who have looked into them.
Yes.
If it was just the United States, it'd be a very different story. I mean, so much of the data that we have on vaccine efficacy comes from Israel. Because Israel is the one collecting data, not the United States.
Right. It's not it can't be a lack of interest. It's just that we're not tracking it. And
I mean, it was so long ago when the CDC said we have no interest in breakthrough cases unless they're hospitalized. So we're not going to keep track of how many people get COVID who are vaccinated.
Yeah.
And it was like, wait, what? Why not?
Like, it's an extremely useful number for a variety of reasons. Like, that is what it is.
It's so weird.
It is what it is.
I'm shaking my hands over here. Let's live in the nuance. Let's acknowledge the fact that people are going to think for themselves whether or not you want them to. And that unless you control all aspects of their life, which you don't at this point, no one does, they're going to have the opportunity to continue to think for themselves. And so if you want to convince them, the best way is going to be through persuasion, and that is going to be through giving them the opportunity to see the facts for themselves. And that is the best way to convince people of anything, and especially in this case, which means that the only way to help people come to your side is to allow dissent instead of shutting it down. And that's what we'd like to see more of.
Yes, the fear has not worked. It may have worked up to a point. It may have worked for a part of the population. It will not work for the remaining part.
Yeah, and with the remaining part, as we've already seen, the more pushing you do, in many ways, you get more pushback.
Yeah, the more you rely on that fear and on that on lack of tolerating dissent, the more persuaded they become that you are the bad actor here, and that your theory, your ideas are the problem. Because if you, and the reasoning isn't crazy. If someone has the information to make a persuasive argument, and instead they put a gun to my head, what am I supposed to conclude, right?
That the persuasive argument really wasn't that
persuasive,
or they would have used it.
Yeah, like that's not that unreasonable.
When you refuse to show me the data, my logical assumption is that the data doesn't support what you're arguing.
Yeah, I know. That's been one of the complaints of. There have been some studies that, by all metrics, seem to have been very well conducted, but do not release the raw data, which is suspicious. There's no reason not to, right? That's how, it's interesting. It's interesting. And I don't know how many of the ones that the CDC uses are like that, right? But that's a red flag, and it's being transparent is being transparent, being honest, making the best case you can. That's the way forward. That is the way forward for both parties, for all political offices, and certainly the best path forward for science, which requires the pushback, the back and forth, the feedback,
the discussion between opposing views, not just people who already agree.
With that, thank you for listening.
This has been an episode of Rethinking Politics. You can find us on all of the major podcasting apps or on YouTube. You can reach out to us at rethinkingpoliticspodcast@gmail.com, or you can visit our website at rethinkingpolitics.podbean.com, where you can support us via Patreon. Thanks, and have a wonderful day.